Hello guys, in this video we will learn about the dependency injection. Dependency injection is a very important part in Magento 2, and how to understand it, how to master it is very crucial thing in order to become a competent Magento developer. So this is the initial setup I've done for the new module I've created, and this is how it looks like. So what I've done is I've created the dependency example module. I have created the module skeleton by module XML file and a registration PHP file. You can check my how to create a module in Magento 2 if you want to. And this is the first bit of this module. The second bit is the controller I've created. So the controller basically is just a route and has the configuration. And also we have a controller called index, and in the index we just return a page object, and we set dependency injection as a title in the page. And in the configuration we have the route ID as dependency and the front name as dependency as well. So you can see here is a dependency and then render the page. You can also check my controllers in Magento 2 video if you want to, how we did create this. And also the last bit is we created a block. The block has just an inheritance or template and has a constructor call, but it doesn't have anything yet, but we will in a bit. And then we created the layout file, which is dependency index and has the block we created, and then assign it to a template file. The templates is just this one and has dependency examples as a h2 tag. You can also have a look at my video blog in Magento 2 to know more about how to create blocks in Magento 2. So this is it, and now let's start with the dependency injection. The first bit we will handle is the injecting the injectable classes. So first of all, let's have a class called, let's have a module folder, and then it has, this is the model, and then I will have a class called injectable. It's just given a name as a reference to the idea of injectables. So I will just make it injectable and it's a class. Now we just have a declare type and then namespace it as training dependency example model class injectable, and this is the class I want to use as inject it into another class. So before we use this class, I will need to create another class, and this will be main class that I use. So if I go and create a class called main, and then in the main training dependency example model class main, so this is the class main I will create. Now I will have a public method called getID and will return a string, and then we'll return just class main. Now this class main will be used, I will inject it into the block. Now to inject a class into a constructor, I will inject it inside here main and then give it the comma. Now you cannot inject the class after the array data because this is optional. The optional arguments are always comes in the last, and then the ones required comes first. So you cannot bring this main if you create it. If you want to inject it, you cannot say something like this. This will give you an error because this is an optional. The optional will come last, and then the required will comes first before the optional. This is required, we know, because it has no default value. Anything with a default value is optional. Anything without default value is required. So this has a default value as an empty array, then it's an optional. This one has no optional value. This one has no optional value, and then you would see these are required and this is a optional. Now what I'm going to do here is I just return the main public function get main, simple get in main, and then return this main. We don't have this main yet, so let's initialize the main. So the class main is initialized and we good to go. Now the main has a method called getID, and this is the ID. Now, if I go to the template, the only thing I can do here is if I go p tag and then class main is id is block get main get id. Now, if I refresh, nothing happens because I need let's clear page cache flush or disable full page. Let's clear full page class Magento. Then Magento. Now we clear cache, refresh, and then we can see there is a class main ID is class main. So this is the first example of having an injectable classes. This class is being injected, so you just specify it here. You don't need to worry about initializing and injecting the class. Magento has an automatic injection in the constructor. So the constructor automatic injection happens on the time when you run the page, the application, and Magento figure out, oh, there is a main class and need to be injected in this constructor. So it will create it and inject it. Once you inject it, then you can use it. So this is a first example of injectable class, but I will provide a more readable examples on how you inject classes into constructors. Now I will use the class main as the main class I use, and then I will make all the examples inside this class. So since I have the class main injected in the example, I can inject whatever class I want into this main class, and then I can use it and I can output the data in the template here. So this is the first example we have done, and we injected the class main and we got the ID of it. Now let's go back to the main class. I will have a constructor, and then in the constructor I will have an optional argument, and I will see how I can use it. Now let's go and try that. So I will create array data equals this. Now if I do this, nothing happen. Now if I can refresh again, it just nothing happened because there's no use of the data. Now I want this to come from the data, this data class main. I want it to come from this data and not from hard coding. To do this, you will need to go to the etc and then create a di.xml file, and then you create the dependency injection file, configuration file. Now you will need to do is write type. In the type, you will specify the class you want to specify arguments for its constructor. Now this is the main class I'm looking for. I will put here the class name, and then I will add the arguments. In the arguments, I will have data. The data will be an array, exercise type array, and then inside the array, inside this argument, I will have items. The first item I will have is ID. The ID is a string, so I will have exercise type string, and then I'll give a value. Now this class main will be injected automatically into array data. Now to call it and use it, make use of it, you go to the class main, you just have initialize this data, initialize, and then you will say this data ID. Remember, this ID, this key matches whatever you set in the .xml file. So the ID will have the value of class main. So this is the data. Now if I flush cache and then refresh, so you see nothing changed. Now the only thing changes is this piece of data class main comes from whatever you added in the configuration file, and it's not hard coded in the class. Now if you go to the main, you get the ID from the data. You don't have specifically or explicitly added this ID to the data. It's not in here in the class, but you have done it from the configuration. And this is the first example of how to make a configuration for optional argument and is as array, and you add to it as ID and then class main. So this is the first example of doing it. Now let's go to the injectable. In the injectable, I will create a function called ID as well. Get ID, and then we'll return a string. Now we will return class injectable. So this will be class injectable, the ID of this class. To do this, I will add this injectable in in the class main. So I will say injectable, and then initialize it as injectable, and then here I will say public function get injectable and returns injectable, return this inject. Oh, I don't need this. Now return an injectable. Now just fix it. To display the data here, to display in the HTML file, we will create another p tag, and then class injectable ID is block get main get injectable get ID. Now this ID should come from this injectable, and then we'll return this piece of data. If I refresh, you see class injectable ID is class injectable. Now this is an injectable because you inject it here and then you get the object. The injectable is always one object. So if you use this injectable class in another class, or if you use it in multiple places, but they are all invoked within one page. So if you refresh and then there are 3 times you have injected, so you have injected the injectable class in 3 areas or 4 areas, Magento will give you one copy. Think of this injectable class as a singleton. Every time you inject it, you will get exactly the one created only once. It's not going to be recreated again when you use it again in a different area or a different class. This will be always one instance. This will be only one object, lives in the memory, and whenever you use it, whenever you call for it, Magento will give it to you. This is not going to be 2 objects when you use it in 2 areas or 3 areas or 4 areas. It's not going to be multiple objects. It's only one object, lives in the memory. Whenever you call for it, you will get it. This is the injectable class, and this is how you get it in the application. No matter what, how many times you call for it, you will get the one object, the one stored in the memory by Magento. So the object manager will give you the object, exactly the same object you are injected it in the first place or second place or third place. So this is the injectable example, and I think I have the injectable explanation already here. So I think this is it for the injectable, and next I will go to the non-injectable classes. Non-injectable classes will be as follows. So if I create a class called non-injectable, and then I will create the class training dependency example model class non-injectable look function get ID and class non-injectable. So this is the class non-injectable. It's exactly the same as injectable. They don't have any differences, but the thing is, if I go to the injectable here, if I go in non-injectable, but I don't want it to be non-injectable, I don't want it to be injectable, I want it to be newable. So it's like you are creating a new object every time you call for it. So the thing you append to it, factory. This factory will tell Magento to create a factory, and every time you say non-injectable factory, it will get you a new instance, a new object, in opposite to the injectable class. Injectable class will always give you the same object. This non-injectable class will give you a new object. So let's have a factory here, and then let's initialize it. Now let's get like function get non-injectable. We'll return non-injectable, then return this non-injectable factory create. Now let's have a look at the generated folder. You go to generated code, you will see there is a training, and in the training there is only controller and then index interception. Now if you refresh the page, class injectable, you will see there is non-injectable factory being created in the generate folder. What does this do? It will create the class non-injectable factory, and then in the create we will get the object manager to create rather than get. So just create this instance. The instance is this, which is the one class we created. We'll create it, and then there is a data argument if there is any. So this is a constructor argument. It will be like a constructor argument. We will come to this next. So it will create this class for us, and then every time you call for this, you will get a new object. In opposite to injectable, injectable will give you the one object created and stored in the memory, but the non-injectable class will always get you a new object inject a new instance of the object. So now if we go to the template and then we have just copy this and then paste it, class non-injectable ID is get non-injectable ID. Now if we refresh, you'll get class non-injectable ID, class non-injectable. So this is the difference between injectable classes and non-injectable classes. Injectable classes will give you the same instance every time you call for it. Non-injectable classes, you will call it by factory, you append the factory to it, and then it will give you a new instance every time you call for it. This is for injectable and non-injectable. Now you also will have interfaces to be injected here. So it's very difficult to have an interface, and you have to explicitly define what implementer for that interface to be injected in the class. So let's have a look and create one for the injectable. So I will create an interface called Injectable Interface, and this injectable interface will be interface injectable interface, and here we can say public function get ID and string turns a string. So this injectable interface will get this ID, and the injectable class will implement injectable interface, and this interface is injected by this get ID is implemented by the injectable interface. Now if we copy this, or we just don't copy, we go to the main, the injectable, we will say injectable interface injected. Now if we refresh, you will get an error, cannot instantiate interface, and Magento doesn't know what to give you because you injected an interface and Magento doesn't know what object it requires to give you. To instruct Magento, to tell Magento, when I ask for injectable interface, I want an implementer. The implementer will be the injectable class, this class, because this implements the injectable interface. But Magento still doesn't have a way of understand how to get you the injectable, because you have this interface in the constructor and you are expected injectable to be given back. Magento knows this injectable maybe implements injectable interface, but it doesn't look for that. Interfaces can be implemented by many implementers, by many classes, so it doesn't know which class to give you. This just happens to be implemented by one class. Now we need to give an instruction to Magento to say, hey Magento, whenever I ask for this injectable interface, I want you to give me the injectable class. To do this, you will have to do it from the DI configuration file. Now I will make this is first. So the node we will use is the preference for which interface or for which object instruct Magento what you want to give me, and then I give you back. So the instruction is for I want the interface. For the interface, injectable interface, if I ask for the injectable interface, I want the injectable class. So I will go to the class and then I copy and then paste here, and this will tells Magento, when I ask for injectable interface, I want you to give me the injectable class. Now let's refresh. Let's say flush cache and refresh, and here we go. We got the injectable class, and this is the ID. So this is how you specify a implementer for interface by using the DI XML file. You can say I want for this interface to bring me or to give me this class, and this is now how Magento understand. When you give me this interface, Magento will know from the DI configuration file, Magento will know that is injectable class will be returned. It will be applied for the same thing when you use a non-injectable factory. Let's do this. Let me have a interface called non-injectable interface non-injectable interface, and we'll have the get ID method, which is a string. Now I will have non-injectable to implement the non-injectable interface, and we'll have this. Now in the main, you can see there's non-injectable factory, but instead I will call it by non-injectable interface factory. Non-injectable interface factory is exactly as you say non-injectable factory, but you can use it with the non-injectable interface factory. This will be applied the same. So I will have this and copy it. I will configure it the same here. So I will have preference, and then it will be for the interface non-injectable interface, and then it will return me back non-injectable class. So this is how Magento would understand it. Now you can see there is injectable here. I want the non-injectable. This is why we got show an error. So I will say none here, and then I will say none here. Now if I flush cache and refresh, now we have a type error when creating object. Non-injectable must be an instance of training. So that's, I think we need clear the model from the generated. We just delete it and then refresh. Will be the same type of error. Third model main type. So if we go to the main, what we would see here, non-injectable interface factory. So this will be the type, and now we get it fixed. This was because the protected non-injectable factory instead of non-injectable interface factory. Now we have done this. We would know you can create factories out of the classes and out of the interfaces as well. When you append it to the interface, you're really asking for the implementer, because if you look in here, non-injectable interface factory will have a look at the implementer. So this is the interface, and when you ask for the interface, it will try to create an instance of the interface. When you have defined in the DI configuration, when I ask for the interface, give me the class, it will always give you the class. So you call for the interface, but you actually, is like you have an array. The key is this name and the value is this object. So this is how you create the interfaces. You map them against their classes, and then you can call the interfaces, and then you can render whatever output from those classes to the page, or use them in the logic, whatever the use case. Now, what is the benefit of having those interfaces? The interfaces tend to be a public APIs that hide the implementation. Now, if I come after you, or if you create me this interface, I can just use the interface and I don't need to worry about the implementation. The implementation is your concern, is your responsibility to make this works without breaking. So every time I come, I use the interface as a third-party developer, or if you create a piece of functionality, even locally, if you give it an interface, the interface will be used. You don't want other developers to go to the implementers, which is the class, and then you see what is happening in here. They want to use this get ID will give me an ID, then I just call it and that's it. I don't need to go through and search what happens here. So it's a way of hiding the implementation by using the interfaces. So this is the main benefit of the interfaces, and also they don't break. You can always get the ID. You don't need to worry about the implementation, as we said. Now we have done those, the injectable and non-injectable. Now let's have a look how we handle the abstract classes. So let's try to create a class called abstract util, and then in space training dependency example model abstract class abstract util. This abstract util will have a public abstract function get name string. Now it has a string. Now let's go to the main, and then I will have a abstract util, and then initialize it, and then say public function get util abstract util return this util. Now if I go to the page and refresh, you will get an error. Abstract util, they cannot be instantiated and cannot be used. So the error says cannot instantiate abstract class training dependency example model abstract util. So how we tell Magento to use a concrete class that is extending an abstract class? Let's go ahead and try to figure this out. So in the model, I will create a class called util, in space training dependency example model class util extends abstract util, and it has a method to implement because we have an abstract method get name, and now what we going to return is class util. Now we have the class util. We want this to be used whenever we ask for the abstract util. In the main, we ask for the we ask for the abstract util, but we want the util concrete class to be injected instead. So to do this, in order to let Magento knows that when I ask for the abstract util, I want the util class, I will have two different methods. One of the methods is to use preferences, so I can have preference, and then for the abstract util, I will have this abstract util. When I ask for abstract util, give me the util class. Give me the util class. So this way, if I flush cache and then I go to the dependency injection, to the template, and then I will have class util ID is get util get name, because we have get name method. Here will be name. Now if we refresh, now you can see class name is util, class util. But this is not the preferred way. This is not, the preferences are not made for the abstract classes. Abstract class can be extended by many concrete classes, and if you specify this, every time you call this, you will get this specific class. And if you have 5 or 6 classes implementing this class, extending this class, then every time you inject this class and then you ask for util2, it will always give you this one. And this is not a preferred way. This is not a smart way to use it. I would recommend not to use preferences with abstract classes. Instead, I will give you a better way to do this. So let's remove this and then flush cache again, and let's go back and make sure it will break on the front end. So it will break here. So now it's broken. The better way to do it is we have arguments. Inside the arguments, I will have an argument called util, and since I specify the abstract class, I can go ahead and inject the concrete class instead of the, so I will replace it with this, and this one will be an object, and now Magento will know when we call the class main with injected abstract class, abstract util, it will give me this implementer or this class, that child class of the abstract class. So this is a better way of dealing with abstract classes. Now if we flush cache and refresh, now you can see it works fine. So it will get the class util. Whenever you do this, is the better way of having, you can do this even with the interfaces, but anyway, you have preferences for interfaces, or you might be having different, maybe 3-4 concrete classes implement the same interface, and then you would specify an interface, and then you can use this with the interfaces as well. But these are mainly for preferences. Preferences is when a interface is created only for one class, and when only one class implement that interface, you create this preference. There is another use case for preferences is to rewrite classes, but it's not very preferable way of doing things. But you might have a situations where are you forced to do this, and it's okay and it's acceptable. But most of the time, try to avoid using preferences of rewriting the functionality of the core or of third-party extension. Now we have this preferences, we have this constructor. There is another thing or another technique in Magento used to handle like a performance thingy. It's created for performance, which is the proxies. Now let's have a class called heavy operation, and then we can see how that works. Now let's go and create a class called heavy operation, and then in heavy operation we create the class in space training dependency injection model as heavy operation. In the heavy operation, we will have the string name, then we have constructor. In the constructor, we will have a method called init. This init called the database, and it has very complex query, and it's relatively slow. But we will have this setting the name. This name equals class heavy operation. Suppose we are getting from a very complex query and it takes very long time. So this is just a dummy. This is not the case. And then you will say public function get name, and will return a string, return this name. And of course, this returns void. Now this class not always used. It's only used in specific cases. And you don't want this init to be called inside the constructor every time the application load or the page load. So you only want this to be called and this init to be triggered when is used. To do this, we will use proxies. Now let's have a look here, and then let's inject the heavy operation operation, and then we initialize it, initialize the heavy operation, and then we get the function get heavy operation, turn this heavy operation. Now this is how we get it. We go to the template, we will say class heavy operation, class heavy operation name is get heavy operation get name. Now if we go to the heavy operation, so we don't want this to be called every time the page load. The only thing we can do is we go here in the .xml file and we specify the argument and its heavy operation, and will be a SSI type object. And to make a proxy of this one, we will go to the class heavy operation, copy the class, paste it here, and then we will have slash proxy. This is the way how you proxy class and make it called on demand. This will be an on demand class. Whenever I need it, it will be called. If I don't need it, it won't be called. And in this way, any heavy operation can be hidden inside method. They're not necessarily called until they are called. They are used. When they are in demand, they will be invoked. Not all these complex queries, complex logic will be hidden, will not be used, will not be called until you actually need it. So now let's flush cache and then refresh, and you can see here it's called. Now let's go see the implementation behind it. Now if we go to the generated and then we have model, inside model we have heavy operation. We don't have the heavy operation folder anywhere except in generation or generated code, and this is because we have this training dependency injection model heavy operation and then proxy, and then inside the heavy operation you will see proxy. So this is the class we have created, but we want it to be on demand. We added the proxy to it, and this is the proxy. And if we can see at the get name, get subject, and then get name. If you look at the get subject, if it's not initialized, then initialize it and then return the subject. You only get this subject or this object heavy operation created when you called the get name on it. So it will not be created, it will not be instantiated. The only thing is going to be instantiated is the proxy. So in this way, this is a lightweight. It doesn't call the constructor of the parent class, and it doesn't call this heavy method. It will be created, it will be instantiated as proxy, but this heavy method will not be called until, or will not be triggered until it is on demand, until it is called in the code. So this is how you create a proxy. It's a normal class, and then you append proxy to it, and Magento will handle the rest. So this is the use cases, or this is the use case of using proxies. The next step we will have a look at is how do we create, or how do we use virtual types. I will create a folder called virtual type, and inside it I will have a name. This class name will be class name, and this class name will be public function get name, and we'll return a name, just return a name. So this is just a simple class will be created here. Now we will have a default name class, default name, and declare type namespace training dependency injection model virtual type class default name, and the default name will be public, or we need a constructor here, and inside the constructor will be name, initialize it. So you would see this is an injectable class, and then public function get name from the default name, and this name get name default name. Now this is the default name. We will have this default name injected in the main. We will have here default name, and we will have to initialize it, and then public function get default name and this default name. Now in the template I will use this default name is get default name get name. Now if I refresh, you can see we get the default name here. Now if I have a specific requirement to get this as uppercase instead of lowercase, what I'm going to do is I will have class here called uppercase name, namespace training dependency injection model virtual type class uppercase name extends name, and then public function get name. What I'm going to do here is we just have this str to upper. So I want to inject the uppercase instead of the name. So I want to inject the uppercase name instead of the name here, and then I get this as uppercase instead of this default name text. To do this, I don't want to corrupt this class. I will need it as is here, but I want it to be uppercase only in one place. And this one place, I don't want to corrupt this. I don't want to have another class to do this. To do this, you will go here, and then you will see there is a virtual type. The name will be uppercase name. You just give it a name, and then the type will be the default name. I want this one. This is the virtual type I'm creating of. So I'm creating uppercase name as a subclass or subtype of this class. And then now in the arguments, one of the argument is name, because the default name has an argument name in the constructor. So I call it name, and then xsi type equals object. And now instead of having the name here, I will copy this class and inject it instead. Now if I flush cache, I refresh, you see there is nothing changed when I refreshed and when I added this, because this is not used. This is just a subtype of this type and it's not used anywhere. So we haven't spoiled, we haven't corrupted this class. So this class is just functional as is by default. Now we want this to be a capital big letters. We will go to the di, and then here in the argument, there is a default name, and the default name is object, and then I will add this virtual type here. Simple. This uppercase will take over and will be given to the default, to the main with class uppercase. Now let's flush cache. Refresh. Now you can see these are coming as capital letters, all uppercase, because what we've done here is we created a virtual type which is a subtype of another concrete type, and then we can manipulate how it works. So you can see we added the uppercase name instead of the regular name, and then it will convert everything to the capital letters. If we remove this, it will revert back to default. If we keep this, it will override it by this uppercase, the uppercase text. Now there is another thing called optional. Optional, we've already seen the optional here in the main. If we go to the main, we already seen this optional, but let's have a optional classes. Say for example, if I create a class called optional, namespace. Now this is optional. If I go to the main, I'll type optional equals null. By giving it a default value, null will be treated as optional. And now I need to initialize it to null. Now I will need to get a public function get optional. This is an optional argument, then return this optional. Now if I go here and then do this, class optional name get optional get name. Now if I refresh, it will give me an error because this class optional has no value, and then it should return an optional, but we don't have it. But if we don't use it, we remove it, now it will work just fine because we never used it. Now how do we add this optional inside class if you want to use it? Now I want to use it, but I want it to be injected in the main. This is simple. If I just copy the class and then I go to the arguments, in the arguments I will have optional, and the optional will be object, and then clear cache. So it's just a normal injection through the di XML file. Now I will refresh, and you can see there is a class optional. The last bit I want to talk about is the method injection. Method injection is very simple. So let's have a look and see how we can do the method injection. So method injection class. Model. Now in the get name, I will inject data object, and then what I'm going to return is data object get data name. Now you can see the method will accept an object, and this is called a method injection once I inject something into the method. Now if I go to the main class and then have a method injection, initialize it. Now what I'm going to do is play function the method injection name. We'll return a string. Now return this method injection get name. The get name, I'm going to inject a data object. Data object needs to be created. A data object needs to be created and injected into the get name method. There is no automatic method injection. You have to create it yourself and inject it into the method. There's always a automatic constructor injection, but with the methods, there's nothing to say there is a automatic injection into method. So we will need to do is we create a data object equals new data object, and then we'll have a name. We call it method injection in the constructor, and then you inject the data object here. So this is the only way you can work with method injection, and there is no automatic method injection in here. So what we need to do here is copy this and then class method injection name get injection name, and now refresh, and here we go how we get the method injection. Method injection is always explicitly injected and there is no automatic injection. I think this is it. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.